Good afternoon. My name is Tony Wright, and today I'm going to be giving a presentation on an introduction to social work. So the topics that I'm going to discuss today are the historical development of social work and how those changes relate to the contemporary practice, the impact of the law on the role as a social worker, the role of the social worker in current practice, the key requirements of a professional body related to the role of a social worker, a comparison of the organisation of social work and social care services in statutory, voluntary and the independent sectors, and then finally an analysis on the main purpose and values of social work. So the concept of social work has developed and evolved greatly throughout history. There was a time in the early 19th century where the role in which we know was divided into various different positions. For example, there were poor law relieving officers, there were school attendance officers and friendly visitors of charity organisation society. Here I will highlight just a few of the groundbreaking changes and developments which made social work what we know as it is today. So in 1864, Octavia Hill, who is a teacher and an artist, began working in poorer neighbourhoods in London. With a financial investment from art critic John Ruskin, Octavia bought 3 houses and rented them to people in need, which saw the beginning and development of social housing. She believed in the self-reliance and the empowerment of tenants, ensuring that her and her assistants knew the tenants personally. Octavia aimed to educate and to change the habits of the poor, instead of them falling into the reliance of charity and never seeing improvement or change in their lives. Then in 1869, Octavia Hill and Helen Bosanquet founded the Charity Organisation Society. This organisation pioneered the concept of casework and home visiting services, which are paramount to modern day social workers, where research was made into individual or individuals needed, aiming to help the poor improve their circumstances rather than distribute the impersonal finance handouts without any further support, education or understanding. During a charity organisation review in 1886, the term social work was first used and has since been a widely understood term for what used to be a variety of different roles. Then, in 1884, the London Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children was founded by Benjamin Waugh, who was a child protection campaigner. Its purpose was to protect children from harm, abuse and cruelty. After campaigning for 5 years, the first UK law was passed by Parliament to protect children from abuse and harm, meaning that for the first time in the UK, harming or abusing children was punishable by law. In this same year, 1889, the London SPCC was renamed to the NSPCC, the National Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, which could then include branches across Britain and Ireland. Further, in 1904, Joseph Rowntree founded the Rowntree Foundation with the understanding and the belief that with ongoing social research was needed to understand and prevent the causes of social problems, as opposed to just treating the outcomes. The Rowntree Foundation is still promoting change through research today. Then, in 1935, the British Federation for Social Workers was formed. Its members included associations for nursing, children, public health, mental health and probation. So the unity of these organisations within the Federation meant cohesion, efficiency and communication between all of these associations. Then, during the Second World War, the Labour government introduced the welfare state, where the government took responsibility for the welfare and the economic well-being of its citizens. Families were given support because of their rights, as opposed to just for religious reasons, which had been the case previously. The British Association for Social Work was formed in 1970 by the unity of many different associations, including the Association for Family Caseworkers and the Association of Childcare Officers and the British Federation for Social Workers, which I've previously discussed. This association has a clear and firm code of ethics and supports the social workers for their best practice. Joan Barraclough, who was the Assistant Secretary in the early years, said that people needing help will constantly pass from pillar to post, which is why they believed they should unite and create one door: social workers. As can be seen throughout history of social work, there were many key elements which led to social work being as it is today: a casework approach to supporting the vulnerable and those in need. As society is constantly and rapidly evolving, the social services is a vital part of many people's lives. It is part of a multi-dynamic support network, providing a person-centred approach to support. So, the impact of the law on the social worker. So, to officially be classed as a social worker and to be able to work as a social worker in the UK, a person must have obtained a social worker degree or master's degree from an accredited university and be registered with their local care council and adhere to their code of practice. So the law provides foundations and framework for complex cases and scenarios that social workers will face, and legal consequences can be faced in times of negligence. However, the law also does protect social workers when intervention is necessary. For example, during the safeguarding of children or vulnerable people. Within social work, though, cases will be complex, and some of the laws on codes of practice are constructed in such a way to allow social workers the ability to not just necessarily follow one path or outcome. For example, the Code of Ethics, constructed by the British Association of Social Work, explains that information can only be divulged on a client with their consent, unless there is evidence of serious concerns or the judgment of the professional believes it is in their best interest. This protects social workers from legal action being taken against them in cases like the intervention of a safeguarding concern. Now, there are several laws and acts that have been passed which shape the way in which social workers can operate. So I'm going to just explain a few here. So, the Children and Families Act 2014. So this act, passed in 2014, covers a wide range of laws and policies, including identifying and supporting children with special needs, the education and healthcare plans, and children in care. It primarily brought changes to the adoption processes. These changes aim to reduce the time that children spent in care, prospectively making the adoption process quicker and easier. Where possible, it was encouraged for children to be placed with a family member or friend straight away, but if not possible, to get them into a foster to adopt setting. It has also taken away the requirement for race, religion, and culture to be a consideration for a prospective adopter. The changes have caused controversy since being brought into place. Here are just a few of the positives, as well as parts that have been argued as negative. So, promoting foster to adopt causes less upheaval for the child having to move home after previously building relationships with a foster family and then having to start again with an adoptive family. It aims to support children with ethnic minorities to be adopted quicker by not having to find families with matching or similar ethnic backgrounds. Also, adoptive parents now have the same rights to parental leave as biological parents, allowing time to settle in and build bonds without financial worries of not working. However, these points have also been argued. There was a doubt that Black and Asian children would be adopted quicker, even without needing to find an ethnic match. If the changes to their act were proven, then the statistics should show that adoption rates were increasing, with the times decreasing. However, in 2020 to 2021, there were the fewest adoptions since 1999 to 2000. Although the pandemic would have affected this year in particular, there has been a continual decrease in the number of successful adoptions each year since there is a short peak in 2014 to 15, just after this act was passed. This highlights that much more is needed to successfully, smoothly and quickly get vulnerable and looked after children adopted. Then on to the Human Rights Act 1998. So the Human Rights Act 1998 stands for every person living in the UK. It is aimed to bring equality for all. Social workers must have a thorough knowledge of everyone's human rights and will support people to empower themselves and obtain their own human rights. However, there will be occasions where the professional opinion can and will override elements for the greater good. For example, respect for privacy and family life. In the case of a safeguarding concern, it is imperative that a social worker discloses information of concern with managers and a network of other professionals to seek the best outcome for the individual at risk. When there is a serious concern for a child's safety against harm or abuse, between a social worker and the courts, children can be taken away from their family. This decision must be made with evidence, information, and purely for the protection of the child or the person at risk. So, roles in a current practice. The role of a social worker covers a very diverse span. They can work with young babies throughout to the elderly, and the role is to protect from harm and to improve the outcome of people's lives. There are roles of social worker working with children in care, supporting and fostering or adoption connections, working with people with disabilities or learning difficulties, drug or alcohol abusers, asylum seekers and refugees, criminal convicts, and the homeless, just to name a few. Social workers must always remain professional with relationships and be an advocate and a voice for the vulnerable. They will work as part of a multidisciplinary team, for example, working with the police, lawyers, doctors, and teachers to create the best outcome and the biggest improvement to people's lives. Often social workers will specialise in a specific role. For example, in mental health care, social workers can be trained to become approved mental health professionals. They are often the link between different organisations. They can offer support with and assist or be advocates through legal issues. There are also statutory and non-statutory roles in social work. So statutory roles are funded by the government, so they must abide and uphold the law and legislations in roles such as the safeguarding of children or positions in local councils and the NHS. Non-statutory roles are often in charities or private positions, for example, working with a charity which supports people with learning difficulties. I'll discuss these a little bit more shortly. So the role of a social worker is often under scrutiny, especially in cases where children are taken away from their home, and sometimes in cases where things go wrong. It is often shared intensely by the media in a very negative light. So, the key requirements of a professional body for social workers. Social Work England is the current regulative body for social workers in England. It sets out specific requirements for what people must know, the skills they must have, and the ability that they must be able to carry out their work before being able to register. Social workers must also re-register every 2 years to keep up to date with changes and training as the requirements for a social worker continues to change and develop. Social Work England issues expected standards, code of conduct and ethics, and sets rules and limits for social workers to work within. If these standards aren't maintained, a tribunal can take place to confirm if disciplinary action is needed. This could result in a social worker being struck off and not being able to re-register with the professional body, and therefore they cannot any longer practice as a social worker. So, a comparison of statutory, voluntary, and the independent sectors. As discussed, the role of a social worker is extremely broad, and there are various specialisations a social worker can take. As well as this, I briefly touched on, there are also various organisations, for example, statutory, voluntary, and independent. So statutory roles include those in social services, local adult and children's teams, and NHS trusts. These hold legal duties and responsibilities. Social workers in statutory settings are often required to assess the need for care and then develop plans and implement safeguarding policies. They can be the link to organise referrals to specialists where required and also work along many other organisations. So, voluntary roles are often within charity organisations. These charities most often begin with a purpose, where a gap or a misjustice has been identified and has then been campaigned for. Unlike statutory settings, this often makes the voluntary roles more specific to their support with services. Although the purpose of the roles and the tasks are the same, but the voluntary roles are not holding the same legal responsibilities as statutory. Therefore, they have much more flexibility and innovation with their intervention, and they can tailor their support more personally to people's exact needs. Finally, the independent sector, which is the private sector, which covers nursing homes and residential housing, as well as the voluntary division. Like all of us other social workers, they are still governed by a regulative body and must uphold the same professional values. They can offer flexibility with organisations such as government agencies to outsource the expertise of and support, but at a much lower cost than employing somebody in a permanent full-time role. Social workers, for example, in the independent sectors working with fostering and adoption, will have the exact same roles and responsibilities as those in the statutory setting. So, an analysis on the main purposes and values of a social worker. So, as discussed, the role of a social worker is extremely broad and diverse, but the primary purpose of a social worker is to resolve challenges faced by vulnerable people. They promote empowerment and support people to gain the education and resources needed to be able to make positive changes in their lives and obtain their own human rights. Social workers working with families to enhance parenting and to promote healthy development for children, although when necessary, they can also arrange the best care and support when home isn't able to provide that for children or vulnerable people. The work of a social worker in other divisions, such as working with people with addictions, will have a very different daily duties. However, the main purposes and values are all still the same. They still provide the vulnerable with support in a non-discriminatory or judgmental manner, and they work with various other specialists to promote positive change with education, opportunities, and assistance. Social workers need a huge variety of key skills, include being able to communicate and listen completely judgment-free. They need to be able to build relationships based on trust, be empathetic, and be sensitive to diversity, always working completely without discrimination. Social workers are normally extremely stretched with many caseloads at once, so they need to be extremely attentive and organised and be able to provide the best possible support for every single person they work with. So, to summarise, the role of a social worker isn't exact or set. It has evolved greatly throughout history and will continue to evolve as the needs of society change and develop. A social worker is a key person in the life of the vulnerable. They're often a voice, an advocate, and a role model. Here are my references used. Thank you for listening.